So recently someone asked me a question about my practice, so I was reflecting on this and thought to share a few things. And since we're in retreat, I thought I'd talk a little bit about retreat. I've had two themes that have been kind of dominant in this retreat, which I'd like to share about. But then I thought about this more, and I thought to place this in a bigger context, and just a brief way to think about this is, it seems to me that that my practice is very basic and brass tacks. That's how I would describe it. And I would say that it falls within the different elements that are in the monastic mind motivation, which is a prayer the Venerable Children wrote years ago when we were very new at being monastics, and we were very outnumbered by lay people, and we were not so great at with our mindfulness. And even just today I realized, oh, I'm the one that she could have written this thing about disruptive movements about, because I can remember all the time I would just pop up, like the doorbell would ring and we'd be quietly, mindfully, and I would just like pop up and go and get it, and like, only today did I think, because I always wondered, what was that about? And today I figured it out. Now that I'm too old to do them. So you can see how my training's been going. But the one, so there's many elements to this monastic mind motivation that, because for me, I have commitments, I have mantras that I do every day. I have one sadhana I do once a week as a commitment. But for me, everything falls, those are like putting my mind and my experience through like this sieve and trying to come out with what's in this motivation, which is to have the Buddhist worldview, to be dedicating my energy and my aspiration to mindfulness, love, compassion, wisdom, and then to be able to put that into action, which she describes in this prayer. And some of those things, the one that I've thought about a lot actually is to be easy for others to speak to, and the impediments and habits that I have that make that so it doesn't happen. And recently I realized that one of those things that I've been working on for a long time, I just took a slightly different tact for the first time during this retreat, which was very helpful for my mind, which was, instead of like, I would purify and I would tell myself I shouldn't do this, I need to not do this, I need to not do this. But it wasn't really working so well. And as I kept looking at it, I realized, well, what do I need to be doing, And then what really helped me was to realize that I need to, in those moments when all this stuff is bubbling up in me, I actually need to have undivided attention on the other person. And that cuts through it. So this is taking a long time, and I don't actually have that down at all, but at least I have something that can kind of stop this flood of energy inside that kind of gets in my way at times. So yes, this prayer, I think, with the stress it has on mindfulness and introspective awareness, having clear knowing of our thoughts, our feelings, our actions, how we're able to be received by others because of these things. It reminds me a little bit of a Catholic father that I met in Spokane. He was kind of a rebel in the 60s, so they sent him to Thailand because he was too radical for the Catholic Church, I think. So he was working with the poor there for 50 years, and then he was nominated for this award that they give once a year called the Opus Prize. And one thing he said was, well, to do my work, I kind of really have to just get myself out of the way. And mostly I was thinking, yeah, I have to get the afflictions out of the way. Today I was thinking, no, I have to get the self out of the way. I should think about that more. I usually focus more on the afflictions and the mental states, but I could use more to just get the self out of the way too. So that's kind of the framework, I guess I would say, in a nutshell. But the two themes that came up this retreat, the first one had to do, well, I had a rather difficult start to the retreat, and I threw myself into Lung. And I worked my way out of that by finally just allowing. That was the word that really helped me a lot. Just allow. I couldn't try or try not to try, or couldn't do anything. And that subsided. But in the course of that, when we had this first go around, I remember saying, it's just ludicrous to be living at a monastery and not to be creating virtue. And that has stuck with me just big time. And so as I was looking at that, what it turned me to, what I've stayed with the whole retreat, is the first two verses from Shantideva's chapter 7 in the Guide to Bodhisattva's Way of Life, where he's talking about enthusiasm or joyous effort. And the main line there that I find helpful for my mind is to find joy in what is wholesome, because that's what virtue is all about, right? And so where that helps me a lot is when something comes up and my mind is not where I want it to be, just to remember that the smallest thing I can do right now that is wholesome, I can find some joy in that. And it's not like a bursting joy or a blissful joy, but it's a very quiet feeling of, yeah, this is a good thing to do. It's like tapping in a different way to like integrity, consideration for others. And it's just a different way, and I find it helpful to always bring that back. And I think what's particularly helpful is to have lived here long enough to have had to struggle with the things that bring you down, which are, like what Shantideva and Lam Rim talks about, is the opposing factors here are laziness, attraction to what is bad, and despising oneself out of despondency. And for me, I think that the last one in particular, I wasn't aware of before I moved here in this way. It's kind of like what Jay Garfield has a line in his readings that we're supposed to be looking at, where he talks about, it's kind of like you have these experiences, but you actually don't even have a worldview or the wherewithal to actually understand your experience. And I feel like that's kind of the case. Those weren't quite his words, but that was kind of the meaning. Like, yes, we have data. We have a lot of experience, and we have, we can look at our experience in our mind and our behaviors and everything in certain ways. But unless we actually have a framework for it, we might not make a lot of sense out of it. It's kind of like you have parts of a puzzle, but you don't even know that you have a puzzle, or something like that. So, yeah, I think the Buddhist worldview, the Lam Rim, and the, staying with these things over time. And then for this thing in particular, recognizing that I'm the one who needs to decide what's wholesome when push comes to shove. And that, and not feel any shame about that, actually, if it doesn't actually always correspond. And you could get yourself into a lot of trouble this way, so you better have some guidance. But at least, I think that because we purify every day, at least once, if not more, and we do pasada every 2 weeks, and we reveal and crack open things, we should at some point be able to get to a place where we can make some decent judgments about that within a worldview, within the Buddhist worldview. And so to have more confidence in that, I think, is helpful for me. So that was one thing, that verse. And then the other thing that's been a theme, unfortunately, and most recently, has been thinking about the coronavirus. And I think that what happened actually was when I first really kind of started paying more attention to it, I had some very strong emotions. I was very sad to hear about what was happening in Iran. I was very sad to know that I'm not going to go visit my mom. I mean, these things didn't last, but when you're in a retreat, you feel everything. And, it's like, that's just not in the cards. I mean, that would be crazy. She's 93. And then sometimes I felt some kind of like overwhelm, kind of like anxiety. And so working with those emotions, I don't know how this came about. I think it might have been from the verse that we do, because we're doing the Shakyamuni Buddha practice. And I really always have resonated with the requesting verses of any practice for some reason. And where we say, glorious and precious Guru, sit upon the lotus and moon seat on my crown, guiding me with your great kindness, bestow upon me the attainments of your body, speech, and mind. And so I have actually been thinking often for the last 2 weeks, what would the Buddha be doing right now in this situation that we're in as a human race? And I don't know how much this is affecting animals and others, but what would the Buddha be doing? And so that comes to mind all the time for me. Like, for instance, when my mind was feeling fear, I always find it helpful when I'm revved up in that way, to look at statues of the Buddha and just calm myself. Like, here's the Buddha, we're doing a retreat every day. He's sitting there, he's watching all this going on, and he is just calm. And I know from my own experience that any amount, even hundredths of a percent amount of anxiety is actually completely useless. So I don't let that go any farther than I can muster to get rid of. So that's one thing, body. But what would he be doing with his body, speech, and mind? Well, I actually think that when you look at our precepts, some of our 348 precepts are very specific about don't throw chamber pots out, and do this and don't do that. And I think the Buddha would be teaching us mindfulness of the body big time, so that we would be, like, for instance, here's how it happens for me. Every morning we bless our feet, right? I don't actually use saliva on my feet anymore. I'm thinking, I'm not going to be attached to this ritual in a way that is not good for sentient beings. So I do touch my feet, but I don't put spit on them anymore, because I'm like, I don't think the Buddha would be going for that. And so my day starts with this mindfulness of body. And for me, the background on that is that particular practice we've done every day for, I don't know, for me, well over 15 years. And when I first moved here, I used to have to always confess that I'd vacuumed up ants or something, and I realized every time I do that prayer, what I'm telling myself until a couple of weeks ago was, I need to be careful how I move through space. I'm very, like, mindfulness of body, moving through space, because I found that the reason I wasn't trying to kill ants when I was vacuuming, but I was careless, and so I trained myself out of that. That doesn't happen. Sometimes it happens in a sink when they fly in really quickly, but I'm better. I have less carelessness because of this mindfulness of body. And I think the Buddha would be saying, yeah, be mindful of your hands right now and where you're putting them and this and that, how you're moving in the world. But I think his biggest thing would be to have compassion, like compassion combined with wisdom, looking at what's going on with wisdom and, figuring out in your own situation what is really the wise thing to do here that's based on compassion. And even that would be based, in my mind, not just on, foremost would be the well-being of sentient beings, and particularly humans, I think, but I don't know what's happening with other species in this. But also even the economics. It is important for governmental people to be concerned about economics, because that also impacts the welfare of beings. But when you have a clash between the two, where do you need to fall in terms of how you're thinking about things? So we all have that in our microcosm and our macrocosm of our lives to think about. So I think it's fruitful to think about what are the essentials here that we need to pay attention to. And I like to think about it with the Buddha, because we're with the Buddha every day doing our practice. So that's kind of what I'm doing.